The minimum amount required to begin the surgery is $1,870. Annie Carter stared at the woman behind the hospital counter, certain she had heard her wrong. $1,870? Annie asked. The woman behind the desk, wearing a badge that read Patricia, glanced at her computer screen and nodded. That's the minimum deposit required to begin the procedure immediately. Annie tightened her grip on the strap of her worn shoulder bag. But she's in pain. The doctor said it was an emergency. It is urgent, Patricia said softly. That's why they're already preparing the operating room. But we need someone to take financial responsibility until her family arrives. I'm not related to her, Annie said quickly. I don't even know her. I found her lying on the sidewalk near the bus station. She was screaming and clutching her stomach. I asked her name, but she couldn't even remember it, so I called an ambulance. That's all. Patricia glanced past Annie toward the double doors where the elderly woman had just been taken. We found identification in her purse, Patricia said. Her name is Eleanor Harrington. There was also a phone number for her son in her wallet. We've been trying to reach him. Then call him again, Annie pleaded. Please, he needs to know. We are calling, Patricia replied. But if we can't reach him immediately, she may have to wait until a family member arrives or until the hospital completes additional approval procedures. Before Annie could answer, a scream tore through the hallway. No, please, please, it hurts. Everyone near the desk turned. A nurse pushed through the double doors, followed by a doctor in blue surgical scrubs. From inside the emergency room, the older woman's voice echoed again, weaker this time but somehow even more frightening. Oh God, my stomach, please help me. The doctor looked toward the desk. What's happening with the deposit and authorization? Patricia glanced at Annie before answering. We still haven't reached her son. The doctor rubbed his mouth with exhaustion written across his face. Her condition is getting worse. If her appendix ruptures, this could become much more serious. Whispers spread through the hallway. An older black man sitting in a wheelchair near the vending machines leaned forward, his hospital blanket slipping off one shoulder. Why don't y'all just take that poor woman in and operate already? He asked. She sounds like she's dying. A woman sitting beside him with her arm in a cast answered before Patricia could speak. Family hasn't arrived yet. No family, no money, no surgery. That's how it works. The old man frowned. She came in by ambulance. That doesn't make it free, the woman muttered. Not in this country. The old man's eyes shifted toward Annie. He had seen her standing at the counter, seen the panic on her face, seen the way she clutched her old bag against her side. Are you related to her? He asked. Annie shook her head. No, sir. But you came in with her. I was the one who called the ambulance. He studied her for a moment, not cruelly, just with the blunt honesty of someone too old and tired to pretend anymore. Then why don't you help her? He asked gently. If she needs it right now? Annie opened her mouth, but no words came out. The woman with the cast looked Annie up and down and sighed. Maybe the girl doesn't have that kind of money. Patricia lowered her voice. Do you have enough to cover the deposit? Annie didn't answer. She just looked up at the clock on the wall. Subless for 17 outrem. Another cry of pain echoed from behind the double doors. This one was weaker, but somehow worse. The doctor stepped into the hallway again, no longer hiding the urgency on his face. We can't keep waiting, he told Patricia. If we don't operate soon, this is going to get much worse. Annie turned to him. Can't you do the surgery now and let her family pay when they get here? The doctor looked at Patricia, then back at Annie. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say yes, but the hospital's rules were older and stronger than his compassion. Patricia shook her head gently. It doesn't work that way, ma'am. We need authorization and proof of financial responsibility. But you have her ID, Annie argued. You have her son's phone number. You know someone is coming. We hope someone is coming, Patricia replied quietly. But hope isn't a signature. The old man in the wheelchair shook his head slowly. Lord, that's a cold thing to say. Annie's hand moved toward her bag before she could stop herself. She slowly pulled out a worn brown envelope, its edges bent from being handled too many times. She opened it just enough to see the stack of cash inside, then quickly closed it again, as if the money might disappear if she looked at it too long. Patricia saw it. The woman with the cast saw it too. Patricia's voice changed immediately. You have the money? Annie pressed the envelope tightly against her chest. It's not for this. The woman with the cast straightened in her seat. Well, if you've got it, pay it. Her family can reimburse you when they get here. The old man nodded slowly. She's got a son. If his number's in her wallet, he'll pay you back. Annie swallowed hard. Patricia tried to keep her tone professional. But the pressure was obvious now. If you can cover the deposit, we can move forward immediately. When the family arrives, you can discuss reimbursement with them. Annie stared at the double doors. You don't understand. Then help me understand, Patricia said softly. Annie's fingers tightened around the envelope until the paper crumpled. This is my tuition money, she whispered. The hallway fell silent. Annie lowered her head. I'm on my way to Pine Hollow Community College. Today is the deadline. If I don't pay before noon, I could lose my spot. The old man's face sank. Oh, sweetheart. Patricia glanced at the clock. What time is the deadline? 12. Behind the double doors, the elderly woman cried out again in pain. And Annie stood there, holding the exact amount needed to end the waiting. Patricia spoke carefully. Miss Carter, if you don't want to do this, nobody can force you. Annie closed her eyes. For a few seconds, no one moved. The doctor stood silently near the emergency room doors. Patricia kept one hand resting on the counter. The entire hallway seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Annie's decision. Annie looked down at the envelope one last time. It was every dollar she had saved. Late-night shifts, cleaning jobs, skipped meals. Years of sacrifice for a future she had fought to reach. That money was supposed to buy her a seat in a classroom. But behind those doors was a woman begging for her life. Annie's mouth went dry. She swallowed hard before speaking in a trembling voice. If I pay the money, will they take her into surgery right away? Patricia nodded softly. Yes. No more waiting? No more waiting. Annie stood still for a moment beneath the cold white hospital lights. And, when her son gets here, she said quietly, staring down at the counter, please tell him I never wanted anything from her. I'm only doing this because she needs help. I'll tell him, Patricia replied gently. Annie gave a small nod. It looked less like agreement and more like surrender. Slowly, she opened the brown envelope. The glued edge peeled apart with a soft tearing sound. She reached inside. The cash had been folded neatly into small bundles, held together with paper clips. Tens, 20s, a few worn $50 bills. There was nothing wealthy about it. It looked like sacrifice, months of skipped meals, long work shifts, and walking home in the rain just to save every dollar she could. She placed the first stack on the counter, then the second, then the third. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the very last bills. She searched the envelope one more time, as if hoping there might still be an extra 20 hidden somewhere inside. But there was nothing left. No bus money, no food money, no tuition, no safety net. Patricia didn't reach for the money right away. Miss Carter, please, Annie whispered, her eyes turning red. Don't give me too much time to think about it. If Annie's story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about kindness, sacrifice, and hope. Patricia's expression softened. She slowly pulled the stacks toward herself and began counting. The sound of paper bills rustling seemed unbearably loud in the silent lobby. 20, 40, 100, 300. Annie lowered her eyes to the floor, unable to watch. Each number felt like another piece of her future disappearing. Finally, Patricia looked up. It's all here. Annie held the empty envelope tightly in both hands. It had become so light that her fingers no longer seemed to know how to hold it. Patricia printed a receipt and slid a form across the counter. I need your signature here. Annie looked down. What is this? It confirms that you're paying the deposit for the emergency surgery. Her eyes stopped at one line printed in bold letters. Responsible party. The words felt like a judgment. But, I'm not related to her, Annie said quietly. I know. I'm just the person who found her. Patricia was silent for a moment before gently pushing the pen closer. Sometimes, she said softly, that's enough to become the most important person in the room. Annie bit her lip. Then she signed her name. The second the ink touched the paper, Patricia picked up the phone. The deposit has been paid, she said quickly. You can take Mrs. Harrington upstairs now. The doctor nearby immediately turned toward the doors. Let's move. The entire hallway suddenly changed. Nurses rushed past. A stretcher rolled loudly across the floor. The double doors swung open. Eleanor Harrington appeared beneath a white hospital blanket. Her face was pale, her frail body twisted as another wave of pain hit her. Annie instinctively stepped aside. As the stretcher passed by, Eleanor's weak hand slipped out from under the blanket. Her trembling fingers reached helplessly into the air, as if searching for someone to hold onto before the darkness took her away. Without thinking, Annie stepped closer. "I'm here," she whispered. Eleanor's fingertips brushed Annie's hand for less than a second. A tiny touch, but enough to tighten Annie's throat with emotion. Then the nurses pushed the stretcher through the double doors. The doors slammed shut, and Annie was left standing there beneath the cold hospital lights, clutching the empty brown envelope tightly against her chest. And Annie stood beneath the cold hospital lights, clutching the now empty brown envelope tightly against her chest, as if it still meant something. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then the old man in the wheelchair let out a soft sigh, his tired eyes fixed on her. "My dear," he said quietly, "I hope life remembers what you did today." Annie forced a smile, though her throat ached too much for her to answer. Patricia stepped forward and handed her the surgery receipt. "Keep this," she said gently, "in case her family asks questions later." Annie took the paper automatically, but the moment her eyes landed on the number printed near the bottom, her stomach tightened. "10 babai tshishimayuan." Exactly the amount she had brought to Pine Hollow Community College less than an hour earlier. The ticking clock hanging in the hallway suddenly sounded louder than before. 11:18 a.m. Annie stared at it blankly. Patricia noticed. "Is your school across town?" "About 20 minutes away, if the bus arrives on time." Patricia hesitated for a moment. "Maybe. You can still make it." A nurse walked past carrying a stack of charts, then paused beside Annie. "You should sit down, sweetheart. You look pale." "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Her knees trembled slightly, and there was a strange ringing in her ears, as if her body still hadn't caught up with everything that had just happened. She lowered herself into one of the plastic chairs against the wall and stared at the empty envelope in her lap. The flap still hung open no matter how many times she folded it down. Annie rubbed her forehead before pulling out her phone. 3 missed calls from Denise. Her chest tightened instantly. She stared at the screen without moving. Then the phone rang again. Annie inhaled deeply before answering. "Mom." "Annie?" Denise's voice came through breathless with worry. "Honey, where have you been? Did you make it to school?" Annie looked down at the empty envelope resting on her knees. "I ended up somewhere else." Silence. "What happened?" Annie swallowed hard. Around her, the sounds of the hospital continued like normal footsteps, rolling carts, distant voices over the intercom as if nothing life-changing had just happened. "I saw a woman collapse near the bus stop," she said softly. "She was in terrible pain, Mom. They brought her here." Denise was quiet for a moment. "Is she alive?" "They just took her into surgery." "Thank God." Annie closed her eyes. "Mom." The silence on the other end shifted immediately. A mother always knows when the next sentence is going to hurt. "What is it, baby?" "They needed money before they could operate." Denise said nothing. Annie pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. "They said her appendix could rupture if they waited any longer. And they couldn't reach her family." Still silence. Then Annie whispered, "I used my tuition money." Somewhere down the hall, a heart monitor beeped steadily. Annie waited for anger. Instead, Denise asked quietly, "Was she alone?" "Yes." "And scared?" Annie glanced toward the operating room doors. "Yes." Denise exhaled slowly. "Then you did the right thing." Annie lowered her eyes to the receipt again. "I might lose my place at school now." "I know. I worked for 2 years to save that money." "I know that too." Annie's voice cracked. "I don't even know if her family will actually come." "They will," Denise said, though her voice sounded more hopeful than certain. "And what if they don't? God saw what you did today, even if no one else did." Annie looked toward the operating room again. "That doesn't help pay tuition." A soft, sad laugh escaped Denise. "No, I guess it doesn't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Denise asked gently, "Are you coming home?" Annie opened her mouth, then stopped. A strange feeling kept her rooted to that chair. She could still hear the woman's terrified scream echoing in her mind. "I think I should stay." "Why?" "In case her family shows up. Someone should tell them what happened." Denise sighed softly, sounding both exhausted and understanding at the same time. "That sounds exactly like you." Annie leaned back against the cold plastic chair. "Mom, I'm sorry." "For what?" "Maybe For throwing my future away. This time, Denise was silent for a long while. When she finally spoke, her voice was so gentle it almost hurt. Baby. There are people who spend their whole lives protecting their money and still end up alone. But today, when everyone else walked past that woman, you stopped. Annie bit the inside of her cheek. Never apologize for having a kind heart. Across the waiting room, the old man in the wheelchair gave Annie a quiet nod, as if he somehow understood the conversation without hearing a word of it. I'll call you later, Annie whispered. You better, Denise replied softly. Then she paused. And Annie? Yes, ma'am. No matter what happens, don't let this world make you ashamed of being kind. The call ended. Annie slowly lowered the phone into her lap and stared at the operating room doors once more. Seblas 42 Azar 10. For the first time that morning, she finally allowed herself to think about the things she had been trying so hard to avoid. She may have just sacrificed her entire future for a woman whose face she barely even knew. The waiting room slowly returned to its usual rhythm after Annie ended the call with her mother. People shifted in plastic chairs, nurses crossed the hallway carrying clipboards, televisions murmured overhead to nobody really listening. Yet Annie sat perfectly still with the empty envelope in her lap, as though moving too suddenly might force reality to settle completely over her. Seblas imiti 1 a.m., 9 minutes. Not enough time to reach Pine Hollow Community College even if she somehow found another $1,870 hiding in the cracks of the hospital floor. The old man in the wheelchair cleared his throat gently. Your mama mad? Annie looked up and managed a weak smile. No, sir. She sounds like a good woman. She is. He nodded toward the operating room doors. Most folks talk about kindness when life's easy. Different thing entirely when it costs something. The woman with the sling shifted beside him. Still shouldn't have fallen on that girl. Patricia overheard her while sorting paperwork behind the desk. Nobody planned for it to. That don't change the fact she just paid nearly $2,000 for somebody she never met. Patricia rubbed her temple. You think I don't know that? For a moment the woman looked embarrassed. I'm not blaming you. Well, somebody always gets blamed in places like this, Patricia muttered quietly. Annie lowered her eyes again. At exactly noon, her phone buzzed in her hand. An automated email from Pine Hollow Community College. Final payment deadline expired. She stared at the subject line without opening it. Somehow those 4 words hurt more than handing over the money itself. The old man noticed her face. That the school? Annie nodded once. Dem. She slipped the phone back into her pocket before she could read more. Patricia came around the counter carrying a paper cup. Here, she said. Coffee's terrible, but it's hot. You don't have to. I know. Annie accepted it carefully. Thank you. Patricia leaned against the counter for a second, lowering her voice. For what it's worth, I've worked this desk 12 years. Most people would have walked away. Annie looked into the coffee. Maybe they would have been smarter. That depends on what kind of person they wanted to be afterward. Before Annie could answer, the elevator doors at the far end of the hallway opened. 2 men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the floor with the alert eyes of people used to protecting someone important. Behind them came a woman in a cream-colored jacket holding a tablet and phone at the same time. She walked fast, heels striking sharply against the tile. Patricia straightened immediately. The woman approached the desk. Street Mary's called regarding Eleanor Harrington. I'm Clara Benson. Patricia nodded. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Harrington is currently in surgery. Clara's face tightened for half a second. Where is her son? He's on the way from Jackson, she replied. Traffic delayed them leaving the interstate. Annie quietly looked away, suddenly aware of her faded jeans, her diner shoes, the empty envelope still sitting in her hands. Clara continued speaking. The surgeon said appendicitis? Yes, severe inflammation. They got her in just in time. The woman exhaled slowly, then asked the question Annie had been waiting for without realizing it. Who authorized the surgery? Patricia's eyes moved toward Annie. Clara followed the look. For a moment neither woman spoke. Annie stood awkwardly from her chair. I'm not family, she said immediately. I just found her outside near the bus stop. Clara studied her carefully, not rudely, just trying to understand how the young black girl standing beside the vending machine had somehow become connected to Eleanor Harrington. You brought her here? Clara asked. Yes, ma'am. And signed the paperwork? Annie hesitated. Yes. Clara frowned slightly. How? Patricia answered quietly before Annie could. Miss Carter covered the emergency deposit. Something in Clara's expression changed. The deposit? She repeated. Patricia nodded once. How much? $1,870. Clara stared at Annie now with full attention. Her eyes moved briefly to the empty brown envelope. You paid that yourself? Annie felt heat rise into her face. They said they couldn't keep waiting. Clara looked genuinely confused. You know, the Harrington family would have reimbursed. I didn't know who she was, Annie interrupted softly. I just knew she was hurting. The old man in the wheelchair let out a low whistle beneath his breath. Clara seemed unsure what to say next. People in her world probably solved problems with insurance cards, lawyers, assistants, and private doctors. Not with crumpled bills from a paper envelope. What's your name? She asked finally. Annie Carter. Clara nodded slowly, committing it to memory. Mrs. Harrington's son will want to thank you personally. That's not necessary. It will be to him. Before Annie could respond, the operating room doors opened briefly, and a nurse hurried through carrying surgical supplies. Annie instinctively stood straighter. How is she? She asked. The nurse slowed just enough to answer. Still in surgery, but stable for now. Annie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Clara noticed that too. You stayed this whole time? She asked. Annie looked confused by the question. Well, somebody should be here when she wakes up. The woman with the sling shook her head softly. Lord, even Patricia stopped pretending to organize papers. Clara glanced toward the operating room, then back to Annie. Do you have family waiting for you somewhere? Annie almost laughed at the irony of the question. My mama's at home. And school? Clara asked carefully. Patricia mentioned tuition. Annie looked down at the envelope again. Deadline was noon. Clara checked the expensive watch on her wrist automatically, then stopped when she realized what that meant. Oh, that single word carried more weight than sympathy would have. The old man in the wheelchair spoke up again. Girl gave away her school money to save that old woman. Clara's face changed completely then. Not pity. Shock. The kind that arrives when someone suddenly sees the distance between sacrifice and privilege. Annie shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention. I didn't do it expecting anything back. I understand, Clara said quietly, but Annie was not sure she really did, because understanding would require imagining 2 years of your life folded inside a paper envelope, then watching it disappear across a hospital counter, while a clock moved toward the future you might never reach again. At 12:17 p.m., the elevator doors opened once more. This time, even the nurses looked up. At 12:17 p.m., the elevator doors opened once more. This time, even the nurses looked up. A tall white man stepped out first, moving fast enough that the 2 security men beside him struggled to keep pace. His suit jacket hung open, tie loosened, gray beginning to show near his temples. The moment he entered the hallway, the air around him changed in the strange way power changes a room before anyone says a word. William Harrington. Annie recognized the name immediately. Everybody in Mississippi did. His face appeared on hospital wings, scholarship banners, business magazines near grocery store checkout lines. He owned half the commercial buildings between Jackson and Memphis, and sat on the boards of medical companies Annie could barely pronounce. But right now he did not look like a billionaire. He looked like a son who was afraid. Where's my mother? He asked before reaching the desk. Patricia straightened. She's still in surgery, Mr. Harrington. How long has she been in there? Almost an hour. William pressed both hands against the counter for a second, lowering his head briefly like he was trying to steady himself. Beside him stood a blonde woman in an expensive navy coat, his wife, Annie assumed, and behind them a teenage girl around Annie's age held her phone tightly against her chest. Grace Harrington. Annie recognized her too from local charity photographs online. Different world. Same age. William looked up sharply. What happened? Why was she alone? Clara stepped closer. We believe she wandered from the caretaker during her morning walk. She collapsed near a bus stop downtown. William shut his eyes for 1 second too long. The guilt on his face surprised Annie. She called me last night. He murmured quietly, almost to himself. I told her I'd visit this weekend. His wife touched his arm gently. William, I should have come sooner. No one answered him. Then Patricia glanced toward Annie again. William noticed immediately. What? Clara spoke carefully. There's something else you need to know. He turned. For the first time, His eyes landed fully on Annie standing near the row of plastic chairs, clutching the empty envelope against her jacket. Clara gestured softly toward her. "This is Annie Carter. She's the one who found your mother." William stared at Annie, trying to process the sentence. "You brought her here?" "Yes, sir." "Were you there when she collapsed?" "I found her after, sir, near the bus stop." "What condition was she in?" Annie hesitated, then answered honestly. "She was in a lot of pain. She seemed confused. She didn't know her own name." William looked away sharply, jaw tightening. "And she stayed with your mother the entire time," Clara added. William nodded distractedly, still focused on the operating room doors. "Thank you. Truly." But Clara was not finished, and she covered the emergency surgical deposit. That got his attention. William turned back slowly. "What?" Patricia spoke before Annie could. "Mrs. Harrington needed immediate surgery. We were unable to reach family right away. Miss Carter agreed to take financial responsibility, so the procedure could begin immediately." Silence spread through the hallway. William looked at Annie again, but differently now. "You paid the deposit?" Annie shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, sir." "How much was it?" Patricia answered quietly. $1,870. William frowned, confused at first, as if the amount sounded too small to matter and too large for this girl at the same time. Then Clara added the part that changed everything. It was her college tuition money. The words seemed to physically hit him. "What?" Annie wished everyone would stop looking at her. "I was already on my way to school," she said softly. "They said your mother couldn't wait." William stared at the empty envelope in her hands. For several seconds he did not speak at all. Then he asked quietly, "You gave up your tuition?" Annie tried to shrug like it was less important than it felt. "I didn't know what else to do." The teenage girl beside him suddenly spoke for the first time. "Dad." But William still looked at Annie. "You don't even know my mother." "No, sir." "And you still used your school money?" Annie lowered her eyes. She was alone. Something in William's face broke then. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for everyone standing nearby to see the exact second a man realized a stranger had shown his mother more mercy in 1 hour than money could guarantee in a lifetime. He turned away abruptly, one hand covering his mouth. His wife looked at Annie with tears already gathering in her eyes. "Oh my God." The old man in the wheelchair shook his head slowly. "Told y'all that girl gave up everything she had." Grace Harrington looked at Annie the way people look at something they do not know how to measure. Not admiration exactly, more like confusion mixed with shame. Because girls like Grace never had to decide whether another human life was worth their future. William finally faced Annie again. His voice was rough now. "How long did you work for that money?" Annie hesitated. "About 2 years. He let out a breath that sounded almost painful. 2 years. For him, $1,870 was a dinner with investors, a hotel suite, an amount his accountant might not even notice. For Annie Carter, it had been 2 years of her life folded inside a paper envelope. William glanced toward Patricia. "You accepted her tuition money?" Patricia stiffened immediately. "Sir, we followed emergency procedure. The surgery needed authorization." "I know the procedure," he snapped, then caught himself. "Sorry, I know." The anger was not really for Patricia. It was for himself, for not answering the phone sooner, for not being there, for allowing his mother to become an elderly woman crying in pain on a public sidewalk while strangers walked past. A surgeon finally pushed through the operating room doors, removing his gloves. Everyone stood at once. William stepped forward immediately. "Doctor?" The surgeon nodded. "The surgery went well." The entire hallway exhaled together. "We got to the appendix before rupture," the doctor continued. "A little longer and this could have ended very differently." William closed his eyes. His wife began crying quietly beside him. The surgeon looked toward Annie. "You got her here in time." Annie looked down quickly, uncomfortable with the attention. William followed the doctor's gaze. Then he looked at the empty envelope still pressed against Annie's chest. And for the first time in many years, William Harrington, one of the richest men in the state of Mississippi, looked completely helpless standing in front of someone poorer than him. The surgeon gave a few final instructions to the nurses before disappearing back through the operating room doors. The tension in the hallway loosened slightly, but Annie still felt like she could not breathe properly. William Harrington looked at her again, slower this time, as if trying to understand what kind of person emptied 2 years of savings for a stranger. "What school?" he asked quietly. "Pine Hollow Community College." "The nursing program?" Annie blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir." His wife glanced at him. "You donated to that building last year." William gave a distracted nod without taking his eyes off Annie. "You wanted to become a nurse?" "I still do." The words came out before Annie could stop them. The second she heard herself say still, something painful tightened in her chest. William noticed. "So what happens now?" he asked gently. Annie forced a small shrug. "I missed the deadline. Can't they extend it?" She almost laughed at how simple he made it sound. "Schools don't usually bend rules for people like me." The sentence settled heavily over the hallway. Grace lowered her eyes. Even Patricia looked uncomfortable. William frowned slightly. "People like you?" Annie immediately regretted saying it aloud. "I just mean, people without money." For the first time since arriving, William seemed to really see the hospital around him, the faded chairs, the broken vending machine humming in the corner, the exhausted receptionist, the patients waiting because they had no better options, and Annie standing there in worn shoes, clutching an empty envelope like she was afraid someone might take even that away. Clara stepped closer to William and lowered her voice. "Should I contact the school?" Annie shook her head immediately. "No, ma'am, please don't." William looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because I didn't help your mother expecting something back. That's not what this is. It'll feel like it." The answer caught him off guard. Annie shifted awkwardly under the attention. I don't want anybody thinking I did this, hoping somebody rich would save me afterward." The old man in the wheelchair gave a slow nod. "That girl's got pride. Leave her that." William looked at Annie for a long moment, then glanced away toward the operating room doors again. "She's right," he said quietly. "If someone pays you back too fast, kindness starts feeling like a transaction." Annie looked up, surprised he understood. His wife touched his arm gently. "William." He nodded faintly, still thinking. A nurse approached from down the hallway. "Mr. Harrington, your mother should be moved to recovery within the next hour. One family member will be allowed in first." "Thank you," he said automatically. The nurse smiled politely at Annie too. "And thank you for staying with her." After she walked away, silence settled again. Then Annie glanced toward the clock. "12, 46 PM." The number hit harder than she expected. It was real now. The deadline had passed nearly an hour ago. Somewhere across town, the financial office at Pine Hollow Community College had probably locked her file already. Another student might even be receiving the spot she spent 2 years fighting for. Annie tightened her grip on the empty envelope. Grace noticed it. "You keep holding that thing." Annie looked embarrassed. "Sorry." "No, I just mean..." Grace hesitated. "There's nothing inside anymore." Annie gave a faint smile that barely held together. "Yeah, I know." Grace opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else, but stopped. She had likely never watched someone lose their future in real time before. Clara's phone buzzed suddenly. She stepped aside to answer it, speaking quietly for several seconds before returning to William. "The caretaker's been found," she said. "She's devastated. Apparently your mother slipped out while she was unloading groceries." William rubbed both hands over his face. "Jesus." His wife spoke softly. "This could have happened to anyone." "No," he replied. "It happened to her." Annie looked down. There was something strangely human about hearing a billionaire blame himself the same way ordinary people did. Money clearly had not protected him from guilt. A few moments later, Patricia called Annie back toward the counter. "There's another form I need you to sign," she said. Annie walked over nervously. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, honey." Patricia lowered her voice. "It's just acknowledgement paperwork since you authorized the payment." Annie signed where Patricia pointed, though most of the legal wording blurred together. As Patricia gathered the papers, she hesitated before speaking again. "You really should ask them to reimburse you." Annie shook her head immediately. "I'm not asking for anything. That's not what I said." "It's fine." Patricia leaned closer. "No, it isn't." Annie looked away. The truth was she had stopped herself from thinking beyond today because the moment she did, panic started crawling into her chest. Rent was due next week. Her mother's medication needed refilling. And now college. No, she could not think about that yet. She folded the empty envelope carefully and slid it back into her jacket pocket anyway. A strange instinct told her not to throw it away. Behind her, William was speaking quietly with Grace near the windows overlooking the parking lot. "That girl gave up everything she had for Grandma," Grace whispered. William stared out at the gray afternoon sky. "I know. What are you gonna do?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he answered softly, almost to himself. "I don't know if there's a way to repay something like that." Annie pretended not to hear. A volunteer passed through the waiting room, offering small cups of soup and crackers to patients' families. She handed one toward Annie. "You eaten today, sweetheart?" Annie realized suddenly that she had not. "I'm okay." The woman ignored her answer and placed the cup into her hands anyway. That wasn't the question. The warmth surprised Annie more than the soup itself. She sat back down slowly while the hallway lights flickered faintly overhead. Across from her, the old man in the wheelchair pointed gently toward the cup. "Go on now. Can't save strangers on an empty stomach." For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Annie laughed a little. It lasted only a second, but William Harrington heard it from across the room, and something about that small, exhausted laugh after everything she had given up made his eyes lower toward the floor. The waiting room had quieted by the time the volunteer came back to collect empty soup cups. Afternoon light stretched through the hospital windows, turning the tile floors pale gold in places and dull gray everywhere else. Annie sat with her hands folded around the paper cup, though the soup inside had already gone cold. She kept glancing toward the recovery hallway every few minutes. William noticed. "You don't have to stay," he said from across the room. Annie looked up. "I know, but you still are." She gave a small shrug. "I just want to make sure she wakes up okay." William stared at her for a second before lowering himself slowly into the chair beside her. The movement surprised everyone in the room. Men like William Harrington usually didn't sit in hospital waiting rooms beside strangers, not unless something inside them had changed. Up close, Annie noticed how tired he looked. Not tired in the way working people look tired. Different, like someone who had spent years running too fast to hear himself think. "My mother hates hospitals," he said quietly. Annie glanced toward him. "She says they smell like fear and bleach." Despite herself, Annie smiled faintly. "She's not wrong." That earned the smallest laugh from him. For a moment they sat in silence, listening to distant monitor beeps and rolling carts. Then William asked, "Why nursing?" Annie looked down at her hands. "My grandma got sick when I was little. We couldn't always afford proper care. I remember nurses being the only people who treated her like she still mattered." William nodded slowly. "She used to say doctors came in looking at charts," Annie continued softly. "But nurses looked at people. That sounds like something my mother would say too." Annie looked toward the recovery hallway again. She seemed scared. "She gets confused sometimes," William admitted. "Started a few years ago. Small things first. Misplacing keys. Forgetting names." He paused. "Then bigger things." Annie hesitated. "Does she know she forgets?" "Sometimes." He swallowed. "That's the worst part." Annie understood immediately. There was something especially cruel about watching your own mind leave in pieces. William leaned back in the plastic chair and looked around the waiting room. "She used to volunteer at churches every Sunday when I was growing up. Packed lunches for people nobody else noticed." A faint smile crossed his face. She'd probably be embarrassed knowing strangers had to save her. "You raised a good son if you came this fast," Annie said politely. The words seemed to hit him harder than criticism would have. William looked down at the floor. "No." A good son would have answered the phone the first time. Annie didn't know what to say to that. Across the room, Grace watched them quietly. She had removed her expensive coat and folded it beside her chair, suddenly looking less like a rich man's daughter and more like a teenager unsure where she belonged. After a while, Clara approached William with her tablet in hand. The college office closed at 1. Annie stiffened immediately. William noticed. "Did you call them?" "Just to ask about their tuition policy." Annie sat forward. "I told you not to." "I know. You don't understand." "Then explain it to me." Annie lowered her voice. Embarrassed people might overhear. "People already think poor folks are always waiting for somebody rich to rescue them. I don't want your money because I helped your mother." William answered calmly. "And if I offered help because my mother is alive? That's different." "How?" "Because then it feels like I sold something." William went quiet again. The old man in the wheelchair looked between them and muttered softly, "That girl keeps talking sense nobody wants to hear." Even Patricia smiled faintly behind the desk. William rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. You know what the strangest part is? What? I've spent most of my life around people who would do almost anything for money. He looked directly at her. And now I meet someone willing to lose everything because of a stranger. Annie shifted uncomfortably. I didn't think about it like that. That's exactly why it matters. Before she could respond, a nurse appeared near the recovery hallway. Mr. Harrington? William stood immediately. Your mother's awake. Relief crossed his face so quickly it almost looked painful. The nurse smiled softly. She's still confused from anesthesia, but she's asking questions. William took one step forward, then stopped unexpectedly. Can she have one more visitor after family? The nurse looked surprised. Possibly. William glanced back at Annie. She's asking for the girl who stayed with her. Annie froze. What? The nurse nodded. Mrs. Harrington keeps saying, where's the girl from the sidewalk? Something shifted in the room again after that. Not because Eleanor remembered Annie's name. She didn't. But because even through pain medication, confusion, and fading memory, she remembered kindness. Grace quietly covered her mouth with one hand. Patricia looked down at her paperwork quickly, blinking harder than necessary. William stared at Annie with an expression she could not fully read anymore. Not gratitude alone. Something deeper. Maybe shame. Maybe admiration. Maybe the realization that his mother's frightened mind had held on to a stranger more tightly than anything else that day. The nurse checked the chart in her hand. She's pretty insistent. Annie stood slowly. I don't want to intrude. You aren't, William said immediately. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, his voice carried no distance at all between rich man and poor girl. Just human to human. He looked at her for a second longer before speaking again. My mother was alone today, he said quietly. You made sure she wasn't. Annie lowered her eyes. No one had thanked her like that before. Not for the diner shifts. Not for helping neighbors carry groceries. Not for staying late after church to clean folding tables while everybody else went home. People usually noticed kindness only after it saved something important. The nurse gestured gently toward the hallway. Come on, just for a minute. Annie hesitated, then followed. As she walked beside William toward recovery, she became suddenly aware of the difference between them reflected in the polished hospital windows. His tailored suit, her worn shoes, his world, her world. Yet somehow both of them were heading toward the same woman. And for the first time all day, Annie realized money had not been the only thing keeping people apart. The recovery room was quieter than the rest of the hospital. The lights were dimmed low. Monitors hummed softly beside the beds. And everything smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm blankets. Annie slowed near the doorway as the nurse pushed it open gently. Eleanor Harrington lay propped slightly upright beneath a pale blue hospital blanket. Her gray hair had been brushed back from her forehead, though a few strands still clung stubbornly near her temples. An oxygen tube rested beneath her nose. She looked smaller now somehow, smaller than the frightened woman on the sidewalk, smaller than the screams echoing through the emergency hallway. William stepped toward the bed first. Mama. Eleanor turned her head slowly toward his voice. For a second, confusion clouded her face, then recognition flickered weakly. William. Relief broke across his face immediately. He reached for her hand carefully, almost afraid touching her too hard might undo something fragile. I'm here. You took your time, she murmured weakly. Despite everything, William laughed softly through his exhaustion. Yeah, I did. Her eyes wandered around the room uncertainly after that. Medication still blurred her thoughts. She looked at the nurse, then the machines, then toward the doorway where Annie stood quietly beside the wall. Eleanor's expression changed. Not full recognition, something deeper than that. The memory of comfort. The girl, she whispered. William looked back toward Annie. Eleanor lifted her hand weakly from the blanket. You stayed. Annie stepped closer slowly. Yes, ma'am. The old woman's eyes watered almost instantly. I remember your voice. Annie felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. You were hurting, she said softly. I was scared. The honesty in Eleanor's voice filled the room differently than tears would have. Old age had stripped away the habit of pretending strength. Annie moved beside the bed and gently took her hand. Eleanor held on immediately. You held my hand outside, Eleanor murmured. Yes, ma'am. And in the ambulance. Annie nodded. Eleanor looked confused again for a moment. Did I know you? No. Then why did you help me? The question landed quietly in the room. William looked down. Grace stood frozen near the doorway. Even the nurse paused charting medication. Annie answered the only way she knew how. Because you needed somebody. Eleanor stared at her for several seconds, eyes glassy from exhaustion and medication. Then she squeezed Annie's fingers weakly. My mother used to say the world survives because strangers keep being kind after they have every reason not to be. William shut his eyes briefly at those words. Annie glanced toward him and saw something painful moving behind his expression again. Guilt, not the kind attached to business mistakes or missed meetings. Family guilt, the kind money cannot soften. Eleanor slowly turned her head toward her son again. Did they call you? Yes, Mama. You answered this time. The sentence was gentle. That somehow made it worse. William swallowed hard. I'm sorry. For what? For not being there sooner. Eleanor studied him quietly, her cloudy eyes clearer now than they had been all day. William, I'm 80 years old. At my age, everybody starts arriving late to things. The nurse looked down quickly, pretending to check the IV line. Annie saw William's jaw tighten. Eleanor shifted painfully against the pillows. But this girl came. Her eyes returned to Annie again. She sat beside me before I even knew my own name. Nobody in the room spoke after that, because there was nothing to improve in the truth. Grace stepped closer finally. Grandma, Annie paid for your surgery. Eleanor blinked slowly. What? William looked uncomfortable suddenly, as if repeating it aloud made the sacrifice heavier. She used her college tuition money so they'd operate immediately. Eleanor frowned weakly, trying to process it through exhaustion and medication. No. Annie immediately shook her head. Please don't worry about that right now. But Eleanor kept staring at her hand, at the fingers still holding Annie's. You gave away school money for me? Annie smiled faintly. You looked like you needed it more today. Tears slipped quietly from the corners of Eleanor's eyes. William turned away sharply toward the window. Grace lowered her face. Even the nurse looked emotional now. Eleanor squeezed Annie's hand again with surprising strength for someone recovering from surgery. Child. Nobody gives up their future for a stranger anymore. Annie thought of the empty envelope still folded in her jacket pocket. I guess I did. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed more by kindness than pain. William finally spoke again, his voice rough. Mama, you should rest. No. Eleanor opened her eyes again stubbornly. I want to look at her. Annie almost laughed softly at that. The old woman studied her face carefully, like someone trying to memorize a photograph before it fades. You remind me of somebody, Eleanor murmured. Who? Myself before life got loud. William let out a quiet breath that sounded dangerously close to breaking. The nurse gently checked Eleanor's pulse. She really does need rest now. Eleanor nodded reluctantly, though she still refused to release Annie's hand immediately. Will you leave? She asked softly. No, Mom. You promise? I promise. Only then did Eleanor let go. As the nurse adjusted blankets and dimmed the lights further, William motioned quietly toward the hallway. Annie followed him out with Grace trailing behind. The moment the recovery room door closed, William stopped walking. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a leather checkbook. Annie's stomach tightened immediately. Mr. Harrington. He opened it anyway. Grace watched silently. William removed a pen and slowly began writing his signature across the bottom of a blank check. Then he tore it free and held it toward Annie. The amount line was empty. Annie stared at the blank check in William Harrington's hand. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood what she was seeing. The paper looked strangely small compared to the weight suddenly pressing against the hallway around them. William held it toward her calmly. Write whatever amount you need. Grace looked from her father to Annie without speaking. The recovery hallway behind them stayed quiet except for distant monitor beeps and the squeak of rubber soles crossing polished floors. Annie did not move. William stepped in. Interest. Your tuition. Your family. Rent. Whatever this day cost you. His voice lowered. Whatever number makes your life whole again. Annie looked down at the signature across the bottom of the check. William Harrington. A name powerful enough to change everything with a single line of ink. Her fingers tightened unconsciously around the empty envelope still tucked beneath her arm. Mr. Harrington, you saved my mother's life. I know why you're doing this. Then take it. Annie slowly shook her head. William frowned slightly, certain she had misunderstood. Annie, this isn't charity. That's exactly why I can't take it like this. Grace blinked in confusion. Why not? Annie searched for words carefully because she did not want to sound ungrateful. If I write a number on that check, she glanced at William, then what I did starts feeling different. William lowered the check slightly. Different how? Like I sold something. Silence followed immediately. Even Grace looked startled by the answer. William stared at Annie for several long seconds. You think I'm trying to buy your kindness? No, sir, Annie swallowed. But money changes how people remember things. He said nothing. Annie looked toward the recovery room door behind them. Your mother was scared and alone. I helped because of that. Not because I thought something good would happen to me after. William studied her face carefully now, not as a rich man looking at a poor girl, as someone trying to understand a kind of dignity he had not encountered in a long time. Grace folded her arms quietly. Most people would have taken the check before Dad even finished signing it. Annie gave a faint smile. Most people probably wouldn't have used their tuition money either. That shut the hallway silent again. William looked down at the blank check in his hand. For the first time since taking it out, uncertainty crossed his face. He had spent most of his adult life solving problems with money, because money usually solved them quickly. Hospitals, lawyers, mistakes, emergencies, grief. Somewhere along the way, people stopped refusing him. But Annie Carter stood there in worn shoes and a faded denim jacket looking at a blank check like it was the one thing she could not afford to touch. William finally spoke quietly. Do you know how many people spend their lives trying to get close to wealth? My mama says desperate people chase money because they're scared of life without it. And you aren't scared? Annie laughed softly, tired more than amused. I'm terrified. The honesty of the answer caught him off guard. She looked down briefly before continuing. I lost my tuition today. I don't know what I'm supposed to tell my little brother tonight when he asks if I paid for school. I don't know if my spot's already gone. Her voice weakened for a second, but steadied again. But I still don't want my help to feel like a business deal. William slowly lowered the check completely. Behind them, the recovery room door opened slightly as a nurse stepped out carrying medication charts. She glanced at the scene curiously before continuing down the hall. Grace leaned against the wall beside her father. So what happens now? Annie shrugged faintly. Now your grandmother heals up and goes home. And you? The question lingered heavier than Grace intended. Annie looked away toward the waiting room windows where late afternoon light stretched across the floor. I'll figure something out. William watched her quietly. There was no self-pity in her voice. That somehow made it harder to hear. Most people begged when life cornered them. Annie did not. She just carried the weight silently and kept standing. William folded the blank check once between his fingers but did not put it away yet. My mother's right, you know, he said. Annie looked back at him. She used to tell me the strongest people are usually the ones the world overlooks first. Grace smiled faintly. Grandma says stuff like that all the time. She does, William admitted softly. I just stopped listening enough. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Annie glanced at the check again. You should keep that, sir. William looked at it too. I haven't carried this checkbook in years. Then why bring it today? He thought about the answer before giving it. Because when the hospital called, I thought money would be the most important thing I needed. Annie lowered her eyes. And then I got here, he finished quietly. Something shifted between them after that. Not comfort exactly. Something more honest. The realization that one person had too much money and the other not enough. Yet neither of them had been able to protect Eleanor Harrington alone. William finally slid the blank check back into his jacket pocket. Relief crossed Annie's face before she could hide it. Grace noticed immediately. You really thought she might take it? I wasn't sure, William admitted. Annie looked embarrassed. I know it probably sounds stupid. No, William said firmly. It sounds rare. His voice carried something new now. Respect. Not the polite kind wealthy people performed at charity dinners. Real respect. The kind earned unexpectedly. A nurse appeared again near the recovery room. Mr. Harrington, your mother's asking for you. William nodded. I'll be right there. The nurse glanced toward Annie with a smile. She also asked if the girl from the sidewalk ate anything yet. Grace laughed softly under her breath. Annie felt heat rise into her cheeks. I'm fine. The nurse smiled knowingly. That's not what she said. After she disappeared again, William looked at Annie one more time before turning toward the recovery room. This conversation isn't over, he said quietly. Annie tightened her hold on the empty envelope. I think it is. William gave the smallest shake of his head. No, he replied. I don't think you understand yet what you did for my family today. Then he opened the recovery room door and disappeared inside, leaving Annie alone in the hallway with Grace, the fading afternoon light, and the strange feeling that her life had already changed, even if she still had no idea whether that change would save her or break her. Annie remained in the hallway for a while after William went back into his mother's room. Grace stayed beside her quietly, leaning against the wall with her arms folded, studying her in the same puzzled way rich people sometimes looked at things money could not immediately explain. You really thought my dad was insulting you with that check? Grace finally asked. Annie gave a tired shrug. No, I just didn't want him thinking money could erase what happened today. Grace frowned slightly. But money fixes a lot of things. Not all of them. Grace looked toward the recovery room door where her grandmother rested. Maybe not. The elevator dinged at the far end of the hallway. Nurses passed carrying dinner trays now. And somewhere nearby a patient complained loudly about hospital meatloaf. Normal life continuing around extraordinary moments. Annie adjusted the empty envelope beneath her arm. I should probably go home soon. Grace looked surprised. Without talking to my dad again? I already did. No, I mean really talk. Annie almost smiled. People from my side of town usually don't have long conversations with billionaires. Grace let out a small laugh despite herself. Honestly? People from my side of town don't usually talk honestly to him either. That answer stayed with Annie. Before she could respond, William stepped back into the hallway. His face looked calmer than before, but his eyes still carried the weight of the day. She fell asleep, he said quietly. Grace straightened. Is she okay? She's asking the nurses where Annie went every 5 minutes, so I guess that means yes. Annie looked embarrassed again. She'll probably forget me tomorrow. William shook his head slowly. Maybe names, not feelings. That sentence settled differently, because everyone in the hallway understood exactly what he meant. Eleanor might lose dates, places, even faces. But fear remembered comfort. Loneliness remembered kindness. William looked toward Annie again. Come with me for a minute. Annie hesitated. Mr. Harrington? Please. The word surprised her enough that she followed him toward a quieter sitting area near the hospital windows. Grace and Clara stayed behind respectfully. Outside, the Mississippi sky had darkened into soft evening gray. Rain threatened somewhere far off. William loosened his tie slightly before sitting down across from Annie. Without the crowd around him, he looked older now, more human. He rested his elbows on his knees for a moment before speaking. How much did you actually lose today? Annie frowned. I told you already. No, I mean everything. She looked confused. Tuition's obvious, he continued. But people don't usually carry exactly $1,870 unless it took something to get there. Annie looked down at her hands. For a moment she considered giving him the easy version, the polite version. Instead, exhaustion made her honest. I worked mornings at Marlene's diner before classes, she said quietly. Weekends too. Sometimes doubles. William listened silently. I cleaned tables at the laundromat on Front Street. Did grocery deliveries for Mrs. Green after church. Saved birthday money. Christmas money. She laughed softly without humor. There just wasn't much birthday money. William's jaw tightened slightly. My brother started putting coins into a jar for my nursing books, Annie continued. My mama pretended not to notice when the power bill got behind because she knew I was trying to save. William stared at the floor now. And today was the deadline, Annie finished quietly. If I missed it, they could give my spot away. Good? She met his eyes finally. Will. The certainty in her voice bothered him more than anger would have. Have they contacted you yet? Annie pulled her phone from her pocket and unlocked it slowly. The email still sat unopened at the top of the screen. Final payment deadline expired. William read the subject line from where he sat. Something moved across his face then. Note shock. Shame. Because for the first time in many years, he was looking directly at what $1,870 meant to someone else. He leaned back slowly in the chair. My God. Annie locked the screen again. It's okay. No, William said immediately. It isn't. She looked toward the windows. I knew helping her might cost me something, but not your future. Annie did not answer. William rubbed a hand over his mouth, thinking. When I was your age, he said quietly, I nearly got thrown out of college because I forgot to pay a parking fine. Annie blinked. Seriously? My father made one phone call and it disappeared. He gave a bitter laugh. I've spent years thinking I worked harder than everybody else because nobody handed me success. He shook his head slowly. Then today I meet a girl carrying her future around in a paper envelope. Annie did not know what to say to that. A silence settled between them. But it no longer felt uncomfortable. Just honest. Finally, William looked at her again. Tell me the truth. Are you scared to go home tonight? Annie smiled faintly, terrified. Because of your mother? Because she'll try to tell me I did the right thing, Annie swallowed. And I won't know if hearing that makes me feel better or worse. William looked down for several seconds. Then he reached into his jacket again. Annie stiffened immediately. Mr. Harrington. No check. She relaxed slightly. Instead, he removed a business card and placed it gently on the small table between them. Simple white lettering. William Harrington. 3 phone numbers beneath it. I'm giving you this because whether you like it or not, my family owes you more than gratitude. Annie looked at the card but did not pick it up. William continued quietly. I'm not asking to buy your kindness. I'm asking you not to disappear before I have the chance to do the right thing. Annie looked up slowly. And what if there isn't a right thing? She asked. William held her gaze. Then I'll spend the rest of my life knowing a stranger protected my mother better than I did. Annie looked at the business card for several seconds before finally picking it up. The cardstock felt thick and expensive between her fingers. Even the printed letters seemed confident in a way her own life had never been. I don't usually call people like you, she said quietly. William gave a tired smile. People like me? You know what I mean. I'm not sure I do anymore. That answer lingered between them. Annie slipped the card carefully into the empty envelope instead of her pocket. Somehow it felt safer there, like something connected to this strange day belonged with the thing it had already taken from her. William noticed. You keep treating that envelope like it still has value. It does. He looked at her curiously. It carried my future this morning, Annie said softly. Feels wrong to throw it away before the day's even over. Before William could answer, Clara appeared near the sitting area holding her phone. Sorry to interrupt, she said quietly, though her expression suggested the matter was important. I spoke to someone at Pine Hollow Community College. Annie immediately straightened. Why? William shot Clara a quick look, but it was too late now. Clara lowered the phone slightly. I didn't tell them who you were. I just asked general questions about missed tuition deadlines. And? Clara hesitated. The nursing program is full. Annie felt something inside her chest sink hard and fast. The registrar said once a payment deadline passes, the spot usually goes to the next student on the waiting list. Usually. Such a harmless word for something capable of ruining a life. William watched Annie carefully. She nodded once like she had expected it all along. Okay, she said quietly. Clara looked uncomfortable. Miss Carter, it's fine. But it wasn't. Even William could hear the effort it took for her to say those 2 words without breaking apart. He leaned forward slightly. No, she shook her head quickly. Please don't look at me like that. Like what? Like I'm tragic. William sat back slowly. That's not what I'm thinking. Annie looked toward the windows. Outside, rain had finally begun falling over the parking lot in soft gray streaks. My mama always says poor people don't get the luxury of falling apart every time life's unfair. She laughed faintly. Guess tonight I find out if she's right. William stayed quiet for a moment before asking, what would you have done if you hadn't found my mother today? The question caught Annie off guard. I would have paid my tuition. And after that, I start classes next month. Her voice softened slightly. Get through nursing school somehow. Work nights if I have to. She smiled faintly at the thought. Maybe someday rent my mama a house where the kitchen sink doesn't leak every winter. William looked down. Such small dreams by the standards of his world. Yet somehow they sounded bigger than most ambitions he heard in boardrooms. Clara's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. The school office director is still there. Apparently they're processing late financial files. William stood immediately. Annie looked up. What are you doing? Driving to the college? No. He blinked at the force in her voice. I mean it, Annie said. Please don't walk in there throwing money around because you feel guilty. This isn't guilt. Then what is it? William looked directly at her. Responsibility. Annie stood too now. Your mother being sick isn't your fault. No, he agreed quietly. But your future collapsing because you stopped to save her might be. The words hit harder than Annie expected. She folded her arms tightly across herself. You still don't understand. Then help me. You can't fix every painful thing with a check. William's expression changed slightly. You think I don't know that? Annie stopped talking, because for the first time all day, she heard genuine exhaustion underneath his voice. Not billionaire exhaustion, human exhaustion, the kind carried by people who had spent years trying to outrun regret. Grace suddenly appeared near the hallway entrance carrying 2 vending machine sodas. Am I interrupting another argument about morality and capitalism? William sighed. Probably. Grace handed Annie a soda anyway. Here. I don't have any money on me. That would be a terrible business model for friendship. Annie laughed softly before she could stop herself. Grace looked relieved just hearing it. Grandma's asleep again, she said. The nurse said she'll probably stay overnight for observation. William nodded distractedly, still looking at Annie. Then Clara's phone buzzed once more. This time she frowned at the screen. Mr. Harrington. What? The school office closes in 30 minutes. Silence. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Annie looked toward the elevator finally. I should go home. William stared at her. That's it? What else is there? You just lost your place in nursing school. I know. And you're acting like that doesn't matter. Her eyes met his sharply then. Of course it matters. For the first time since he arrived at the hospital, real emotion cracked through her calm voice. I'm scared out of my mind right now, she admitted quietly. But your mother's alive, so I'm trying very hard not to hate myself for choosing that. Nobody spoke after that. Not Grace. Not Clara. Not even William. Because there was nothing clean or simple left inside the situation anymore. Only sacrifice sitting in the middle of the room like something nobody quite knew how to hold. Finally, William picked up his suit jacket from the chair beside him. Annie noticed immediately. You're still going? Yes. I told you not to. And I heard you. Then why? Because, William interrupted quietly, whether you accept help or not, I refuse to sit here doing nothing while the person who saved my mother loses her future in the same building where people claim they train caregivers. Annie opened her mouth, then stopped. William stepped closer, lowering his voice. You said money changes how people remember things. He nodded slowly. Maybe. But sometimes refusing to use power when you have it changes people too. Rain continued tapping against the windows as they stared at each other. Then Grace spoke softly from behind them. Dad's right about one thing. Annie glanced toward her. If someone like you can lose everything for doing the right thing, Grace swallowed lightly, then something's broken. Rain followed them all the way to Pine Hollow Community College. Annie sat in the back seat of William Harrington's SUV beside Grace, watching water slide down the dark windows while Clara drove through the nearly empty streets. The hospital lights had long disappeared behind them, replaced by closed diners, gas stations glowing beneath wet pavement, and old storefronts already shutting down for the night. Nobody spoke much during the drive. Annie still wasn't sure why she had agreed to come. Part of her wanted to jump out at every red light and walk home before things became more complicated. Another part knew this day had already crossed the point where normal pride could keep pretending everything would somehow fix itself. William sat beside Clara in the front passenger seat, making calls in a low voice. Yes, this is William Harrington. I understand policy, Dean Porter. No, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking you to hear the full situation before making a decision. Annie stared at the rain outside. Special treatment. That was exactly what terrified her. People always found it easier to respect poor people when they stayed poor quietly. Grace glanced toward Annie. You okay? Annie laughed softly. Not even close. That makes 2 of us. Annie looked over. Grace tucked loose hair behind one ear awkwardly. I keep thinking about what Grandma said. What part? The world survives because strangers keep being kind after they have every reason not to. Grace shook her head faintly. I don't think people in my world hear things like that enough. Annie gave a tired smile. People in mine hear it all the time. We just usually say it at funerals. That answer stayed in the car for a while. When they finally pulled into Pine Hollow Community College, only a few office lights still burned across campus. Rain misted through the parking lot beneath yellow street lamps. Annie had imagined arriving here all day with excitement in her chest and tuition money in her pocket. Instead, she stepped out carrying an empty envelope beside one of the richest men in Mississippi. Life had a strange sense of humor. Inside the administration building, the halls were nearly deserted. Clara led them toward the financial office where a tired receptionist looked up from her desk and immediately froze at the sight of William Harrington walking in. "Good evening," Clara said politely. "We're here to speak with Dean Porter." The woman blinked twice before standing quickly. "Of course, right this way." Annie wanted to disappear. Every pair of eyes they passed lingered on her longer than usual. Some recognized William. Others noticed the contrast immediately. Billionaire in a tailored coat beside a black girl in worn diner shoes holding a folded brown envelope. Dean Porter met them inside a conference room near the back office. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses hanging low on his nose and the exhausted posture of someone who had worked in education too long to believe rules solved everything. "Mr. Harrington," he said carefully, "this is unexpected." William shook his hand once. "Thank you for staying late." Dean Porter glanced toward Annie. "Miss Carter." Annie nodded quietly. Another woman sat at the far end of the table sorting paperwork. Mrs. Whitcomb. The moment she saw Annie, her expression tightened slightly. "I already explained the policy over the phone," she said before anyone sat down. "The nursing program reached capacity this afternoon." William remained standing. "Before or after her payment deadline passed?" Mrs. Whitcomb frowned faintly. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "I think you do." The room cooled immediately. Dean Porter adjusted his glasses. "Perhaps we should all sit." Nobody moved at first. Then Annie quietly pulled out a chair. "Please don't fight over me." William looked at her. "This isn't fighting." "It sounds like it." Mrs. Whitcomb folded her hands neatly on the table. "Miss Carter, no one is questioning your character. But deadlines exist because institutions require order." Annie lowered her eyes. She had heard versions of that sentence her whole life. Order, procedure, police, words that somehow always landed hardest on people without money. William spoke calmly, though tension sat beneath every word now. "Miss Carter missed your deadline because she stopped to save my mother's life." Mrs. Whitcomb answered just as calmly. "And that is admirable. But if we bend policy for one student—" "She didn't oversleep," William interrupted. "She didn't forget paperwork. She used her tuition money to authorize emergency surgery for a dying woman." Dean Porter looked toward Annie slowly. "Is that true?" Annie wished the floor would swallow her whole. "Yes, sir." Mrs. Whitcomb shifted uncomfortably but stayed firm. "Again, nobody disputes the circumstances. But there are waiting list students who also deserve fairness." William nodded once. "You're right." The answer surprised everyone. He stepped closer to the table. "So let's talk about fairness." Mrs. Whitcomb went quiet. William's voice lowered. "A young woman spends 2 years working for an education. On the way to pay for that education, she saves a life because every other person walking past decided somebody else would help." He looked directly at Mrs. Whitcomb. "Then the system designed to train caregivers punishes her for acting like one before she ever stepped into a classroom." Nobody spoke. Rain tapped softly against the conference room windows. Dean Porter slowly removed his glasses. "Miss Carter, why didn't you simply ask Mr. Harrington for reimbursement?" Annie looked down at the empty envelope in her lap. "Because I didn't want helping someone to become a transaction." The room fell completely silent after that. Even Mrs. Whitcomb stopped touching the paperwork in front of her. William looked at Annie for a long moment before turning back toward the dean. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly why she belongs in your nursing program." Dean Porter leaned back slowly in his chair after William spoke. Rain continued tapping against the windows behind him while the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. For several seconds, nobody in the conference room moved. Then Mrs. Whitcomb cleared her throat carefully. "Character and policy are not always the same thing." William nodded once. "That may be true, but schools decide every day what kind of people they reward." Mrs. Whitcomb looked toward Annie again. "Miss Carter, if we reopened one seat every time someone had a personal hardship—" "It wasn't a hardship," Annie interrupted quietly. The room turned toward her. Annie tightened her hands around the empty envelope resting in her lap. "A hardship is when life happens to you. I made a choice." Dean Porter studied her carefully over folded hands. "And do you regret it?" The question settled heavily across the room. Annie thought about the hospital hallway. Eleanor Harrington crying out in pain. The old man in the wheelchair lowering his head and whispering, "Lord, have mercy." Her mother's voice on the phone telling her not to be ashamed of having a soft heart. Then she thought about the unopened email still sitting in her phone. Final payment deadline expired. her future balanced against a stranger's life. Annie answered honestly, "I regret that the world makes people choose between helping somebody and protecting themselves." Her voice stayed calm. "But no, sir. I don't regret helping her." Dean Porter slowly removed his glasses again. Mrs. Whitcomb looked down at the paperwork in front of her, though Annie could tell the older woman was no longer seeing it clearly. William remained silent now. He had already said enough. The dean folded his hands together. "How many students are currently on the nursing wait list?" Mrs. Whitcomb glanced at her files. 3. "And how many accepted students failed to complete payment before the deadline this semester?" She hesitated. 7. William's eyes narrowed slightly. Dean Porter noticed. "Meaning?" Mrs. Whitcomb sighed quietly. "Meaning some seats usually reopen within the first 2 weeks anyway." Annie blinked. William looked at the dean but said nothing. The older man turned toward Annie again. "Miss Carter, if your place in the program were restored, would you still intend to enroll?" Annie stared at him. "Yes, sir. Even after today?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" The answer came faster this time. "Because people remember who sat beside them when they were afraid." Silence followed. Grace lowered her eyes immediately. William looked toward the windows. Even Mrs. Whitcomb's expression softened slightly. Dean Porter let out a slow breath through his nose. "You know," he said quietly, "most applicants spend interviews telling us why they deserve to become nurses." He glanced at Annie. "You already showed us." Mrs. Whitcomb looked over carefully. "Dean," he raised one hand gently, stopping her. Then he turned back toward Annie. "Miss Carter, Pine Hollow Community College cannot refund the tuition money you used today." Annie nodded once. "I understand. But," he continued, "the school does maintain a small emergency scholarship fund for students facing extraordinary circumstances." Annie stared at him without breathing. Mrs. Whitcomb looked surprised. "That fund was meant for housing displacement and family emergencies." Dean Porter nodded calmly. "And today a student gave up her tuition to save a human life before she ever attended her first nursing class." He paused. "If that does not qualify as extraordinary, I'm not sure what does." Annie's eyes widened slightly. William lowered his head for a second, relief crossing his face quietly. The dean opened a folder from the corner of his desk and signed several papers carefully. Then he slid them across the table toward Annie. "Your seat in the nursing program will remain open." Annie looked down at the papers but did not touch them yet. "You're also receiving a full emergency grant covering this semester's tuition," Dean Porter continued. "No repayment required." The room blurred slightly around her. For a second, Annie genuinely thought she might cry, which embarrassed her more than losing the money had. Mrs. Whitcomb adjusted her glasses quietly. "There will still be orientation paperwork." Grace laughed softly under her breath, wiping quickly beneath one eye. William finally leaned back in his chair for the first time all evening. Annie looked at the forms again, then at Dean Porter. "Why?" The older man smiled faintly. "Because sometimes institutions should recognize character before credentials." Annie lowered her head quickly, overwhelmed. William watched her carefully. "You okay?" She laughed once through shaky breathing. "I don't know yet." "That's fair." Annie finally picked up the papers with trembling fingers. Her eyes landed on the line beneath the grant approval. "Student status. Active." The words hit harder than she expected. Active. Not lost. Not expired. Not gone. Across the room, Mrs. Whitcomb quietly closed the file that had nearly ended Annie's future an hour earlier. Dean Porter stood slowly from his chair. "One more thing, Miss Carter." Annie looked up. "When you graduate from this program someday, I hope you remember tonight." "I will." "No," he said gently. "I mean the feeling. The part where kindness almost cost you everything." His expression grew serious. People in medicine sometimes forget poor families are often one emergency away from losing their future too. Annie nodded slowly, because she understood that feeling now in a way no textbook could ever teach. William stood beside her as the meeting ended. "Looks like you're going to nursing school after all." Annie looked down at the empty brown envelope still tucked beneath her arm. Slowly she opened it. Inside sat William's business card and now, folded carefully beside it, her reinstatement papers. The envelope no longer felt empty. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. As they walked out of the administration building together, Grace slipped beside Annie with a small smile. "You know Grandma's going to tell this story forever now." Annie laughed softly. "She'll probably forget half of it, Grace shook her head. Not the important half. William held the door open behind them as cool night air drifted across campus. Students hurried through puddles beneath streetlights, unaware that inside the building a girl had nearly lost her future for doing the right thing, and somehow walked back out carrying it again. Annie paused at the top of the steps and looked across the quiet campus. Tomorrow she would still have bills. Her mother's kitchen sink would still leak. Life would still be hard. But somewhere behind her, an old woman was alive. And somewhere ahead of her, a classroom seat still waited with her name on it. This story reminds us that true kindness is not measured by how much money a person has, but by what they are willing to sacrifice for someone else. Annie had every reason to protect her own future, yet she chose compassion over convenience when a stranger needed help. In a world where many people walk past suffering, the story shows that quiet acts of humanity can still change lives. Sometimes the people with the least give the most, and real character is revealed not when life is easy, but when doing the right thing comes at a cost. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.